What started as a simple photography trip to an abandoned lighthouse on the Maine coast turned into the most horrifying supernatural encounter of my entire life. I thought I was just exploring a piece of forgotten maritime history, but I discovered something far more sinister lurking in those crumbling walls. The Beacon Point Lighthouse has been abandoned since 1962, but locals whisper about the ghost of Thomas Whitmore, the lighthouse keeper who mysteriously vanished during a violent storm. What I experienced there defies all logical explanation, and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the supernatural world. This is my true story of encountering something that should not exist. If you're fascinated by real paranormal encounters, unexplained mysteries, and true supernatural horror stories, this video will give you chills. I'm sharing every terrifying detail of what happened that night, and why I believe some places are meant to stay abandoned forever.
Don't forget to like this video if it gives you goosebumps, subscribe for more spine-chilling true stories, and hit that notification bell so you never miss our supernatural content. Let me know in the comments if you've ever experienced something paranormal. I read every single one. Lighthouse hauntings represent some of the most compelling paranormal phenomena in American folklore.
These isolated structures, often built on rocky coastlines where countless ships have met their doom, seem to attract supernatural activity. The combination of isolation, tragic maritime history, and the emotional intensity of lighthouse keepers who spent years alone watching over dangerous waters creates the perfect conditions for residual spiritual energy. The psychological impact of encountering the supernatural in such isolated locations cannot be understated. When you're miles from civilization, surrounded by nothing but ocean and darkness, your mind becomes hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every unexplainable occurrence. This heightened state of awareness often makes supernatural encounters more intense and memorable than those experienced in familiar environments. Our supernatural stories were such a paranormal encounter, our true horror stories are a haunted lighthouse, our ghost story, our such paranormal activity, our supernatural horror, our real ghost encounter, our abandoned places, our maritime history, our unexplained mysteries, our creepy stories, our haunted places, our ghost hunting, our paranormal investigation, Redar's true crime, Rita mystery stories, Redar's coastal horror, Rita lighthouse ghost, Rita supernatural phenomena, Rita scary, Rita horror, Rita chilling, Rita terrifying, Rita haunted 4. Tags, video tag list. Supernatural stories, paranormal encounter, true horror stories, haunted lighthouse, ghost story, paranormal activity, supernatural horror, real ghost encounter, abandoned places, maritime history, unexplained mysteries, creepy stories, haunted places, ghost hunting, paranormal investigation, lighthouse ghosts, scary horror, terrifying, haunted, coastal horror, mystery stories, supernatural phenomena, true story, chilling encounter. 5. Complete video script. 10,000 words. Paragraph 1, 2,000 words. The setup and first supernatural contact. I should have listened to the locals in Millbridge, Maine when they warned me about Beacon Point Lighthouse. But as a professional photographer specializing in abandoned historical sites, I'd heard these kinds of warnings before. Every forgotten place has its ghost stories, its local legends designed to keep curious outsiders away. I thought this would be just another fascinating shoot for my portfolio on America's forgotten maritime heritage. I was catastrophically wrong. The lighthouse had been calling to me for months after I first discovered it on an old maritime survey map from 1898. Beacon Point Light Station, established in 1847, decommissioned in 1962. 57 years of guiding ships safely through the treacherous waters off Maine's coast, and then, nothing. The Coast Guard had automated the light systems by then, making lighthouse keepers obsolete. But something about this particular lighthouse felt different from the moment I saw those faded photographs in the Millbridge Historical Society. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the Society's elderly curator, had hesitated when I asked about accessing the lighthouse. Her weathered hands trembled slightly as she pulled out the location documents. "That place has been empty for over 60 years, she said quietly, but it's never really been alone. When I pressed her for details, she mentioned Thomas Whitmore, the last lighthouse keeper who vanished during the hurricane of 1962. His body was never found, but the lighthouse lamp kept burning for 3 days after the storm passed, even though the power lines had been torn down and the generator destroyed. Let me know in the comments if you've experienced something similar to what I'm about to share with you. The drive to Beacon Point took me down increasingly narrow roads until I was bouncing along a rutted dirt path that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. Ancient pine trees pressed in from both sides, their branches creating a tunnel effect that blocked out most of the afternoon sun. When the lighthouse finally came into view, I felt something shift in the atmosphere around me. The white-painted tower stood about 60 feet tall, its red roof faded to a rust-brown color. The attached keeper's house was in worse condition, with several windows boarded up and ivy crawling up the weathered clapboard siding. I parked my Jeep about 100 yards away and spent several minutes just observing the structure through my camera lens. That's when I noticed something that made me pause. Despite being abandoned for over 6 decades, there were no obvious signs of vandalism or graffiti. Most abandoned buildings I've photographed show evidence of teenagers or urban explorers leaving their mark, but Beacon Point appeared untouched. Even the weeds around the base of the lighthouse seemed to grow in neat, almost respectful circles, as if nature itself was maintaining some kind of boundary. The front door of the keeper's house was secured with a modern padlock, but I'd already obtained permission from the current property owners to explore and photograph the site. As I worked the lock open, I felt a strange sensation wash over me, like someone was watching from one of those dark windows above. I turned around quickly, scanning the tree line and the lighthouse itself, but saw nothing unusual. Just the normal sounds of wind through pine needles and distant waves crashing against the rocky shore below. Hit the like button if this story is already giving you chills. Inside the keeper's house, dust particles danced in shafts of afternoon light streaming through the few unboarded windows. The rooms were mostly empty, with just a few pieces of furniture covered in white sheets that looked like ghosts themselves. I began documenting everything methodically, starting with the kitchen where a 1950s-era stove still sat against the far wall, its chrome surfaces dulled with age. The cabinets were painted a cheerful yellow that had faded to an unsettling jaundice color. As I moved through the house, I noticed something peculiar about the temperature. Despite the warm September afternoon outside, certain areas of the house felt significantly colder than others. This wasn't unusual in old buildings. Drafts and air circulation patterns can create temperature variations, but these cold spots seemed to move. I'd feel a chill on my arms while photographing the living room, then step into the hallway and feel normal temperature, only to encounter the same cold sensation a few minutes later in a completely different location. The staircase to the second floor creaked ominously under my weight. Each step seemed to echo longer than it should have in the modest-sized house. Upstairs, I found 3 small bedrooms and what appeared to be a study or office. One bedroom was clearly the master bedroom, still containing a metal bed frame and a wardrobe with peeling veneer. The study contained a desk positioned near the window that faced out toward the lighthouse tower, where the keeper could have watched the light's rotation during his off-duty hours. It was in this study that I experienced the first truly unexplainable event. While photographing the desk, I noticed a leather-bound logbook sitting open on the surface. This was unusual because the property managers had told me the house had been completely cleared out years ago. The logbook appeared to be a lighthouse keeper's daily record, with entries written in careful cursive handwriting. The pages were yellowed with age, but the ink looked remarkably fresh. I leaned in closer to read the entries, and my blood went cold. The dates were from September 1962, just days before Hurricane Donna struck the Maine coast. The final entry, dated September 12, 1962, read, "Strange sounds from the tower again last night. The light keeps flickering even though I've checked all the connections 3 times. Something is not right here. If anything happens to me, tell Martha I love her. The sea is calling, but I won't abandon my post. T. Whitmore." Subscribe if you want to hear more terrifying true stories like this one. I photographed every page of that logbook, my hands shaking slightly as I turned the yellowed paper. The entries from the final week painted a picture of a man slowly losing his grip on reality or encountering something beyond rational explanation. He wrote about voices calling his name from the tower at night, about the lighthouse beam moving on its own to illuminate empty stretches of ocean, about cold spots that followed him through the keeper's house. As I finished photographing the logbook, I heard a sound that made every hair on my neck stand on end. It was a deep, resonant horn blast that seemed to come from the lighthouse itself. But Beacon Point's foghorn had been disconnected in 1962, and I could see from the window that the mechanism was missing from the tower entirely. The sound lasted for about 10 seconds, then faded into the afternoon air like it had never happened. I stood frozen in that study for several minutes, listening intently for any follow-up sounds, but heard only the normal ambient noise of wind and distant waves. Perhaps it had been a ship's horn from somewhere out on the ocean, carried by the wind and acoustics of the coastline. That had to be it. There was no other logical explanation. But as I prepared to leave the study, I glanced back at the desk one final time. The logbook was gone. The surface of the desk was covered with the same layer of undisturbed dust I'd seen when I first entered the room, as if the logbook had never been there at all. I checked the floor around the desk, opened the desk drawers, looked under the scattered papers that remained. Nothing. The logbook had simply vanished. Comment below what you think was really happening here. I spent the next hour methodically searching the entire second floor, convincing myself that I must have knocked the logbook onto the floor or somehow moved it without realizing, but it was nowhere to be found. More disturbing than its disappearance was the fact that when I reviewed the photographs on my camera, the images of the logbook pages showed nothing but an empty desk surface. The camera had captured dozens of photos of the desk, the chair, the window, but no logbook at all. This was when I should have left. Every rational part of my mind was screaming that something was very wrong at Beacon Point, and that I needed to pack up my equipment and drive back to town immediately. Instead, I found myself drawn to the lighthouse tower itself. The door at the base of the tower was unlocked, which surprised me given that the keeper's house had been secured. The hinges groaned loudly as I pulled it open, revealing a narrow spiral staircase that curved upward into darkness. The inside of the lighthouse was even colder than the strange spots in the keeper's house. My breath was visible in small puffs as I began climbing the metal stairs, their open construction allowing me to see all the way up to the lens room at the top. Each step rang out with a metallic clang that echoed strangely in the confined space. About halfway up, I paused to catch my breath and noticed something that made my stomach drop. Below me, on the stairs I had just climbed, were wet footprints. They weren't my footprints. I was wearing hiking boots with a distinctive waffle pattern, but these prints appeared to be from bare feet, adult-sized with clearly defined toe marks, and they were dripping wet as if someone had just emerged from the ocean. The prints seemed to be following the same path I had taken, appearing on each step I had used, but they hadn't been there moments before. Let me know if you want me to investigate this further. I fumbled for my camera to photograph the wet prints, but by the time I had it ready, they were gone. The metal steps were completely dry, showing only the rust stains and normal wear patterns you'd expect in an abandoned lighthouse. I convinced myself it must have been condensation from my breathing in the cold air, combined with the strange lighting conditions inside the tower. But even as I formed these rational explanations, I knew they didn't quite fit what I had witnessed. Continuing up the staircase required all my willpower. Every instinct was telling me to go back down, to leave this place immediately, but I had never left a photography project incomplete, and my professional pride pushed me forward. The lens room at the top of the lighthouse was larger than I expected, with windows facing in all directions to provide a 360-degree view of the surrounding coastline. The massive Fresnel lens that had once focused the lighthouse beam was gone, removed when the station was decommissioned, but the mounting hardware remained. As I set up my tripod to capture the sunset views from the lens room, I noticed something troubling. The sun was setting in the wrong direction. I had climbed the lighthouse facing east toward the ocean, but the sun was clearly setting through the windows that should have faced west toward the mainland. I checked my compass and confirmed that I was completely disoriented. According to the compass, the ocean was now to the west, and the forested mainland was to the east. This was impossible. I had driven to the lighthouse on a road that approached from the west, with the ocean clearly visible to the east. The lighthouse was built on a point of land that jutted into the Atlantic Ocean, with water on three sides and the mainland to the west. But from inside the lens room, everything appeared reversed, as if the entire lighthouse had somehow rotated 180 degrees while I was climbing the stairs. Share your own paranormal experiences in the comments section. I spent several minutes trying to rationalize this disorientation, checking and rechecking my compass, looking for landmarks I recognized from my drive-in. Nothing made sense. The view from the lens room showed an endless expanse of dark forest to the west, where the ocean should have been, and calm waters stretching to the horizon in the east, where the mainland should have been. It was as if I had somehow been transported to a mirror image of the real Beacon Point. Paragraph 2, 2,000 words. Paranormal activity escalation and growing fear. The spatial disorientation I experienced in the lens room was just the beginning of something far more sinister. As I tried to make sense of the impossible geography I was witnessing, the sun seemed to accelerate its descent toward the horizon. What should have been a gradual sunset over the course of an hour compressed into mere minutes, plunging the lighthouse into an unnatural twilight that felt thick and oppressive. I decided to descend immediately, but as I reached for my camera equipment, something made me freeze. Through the eastern windows, which should have shown forested mainland but instead revealed dark ocean, I could see a light moving on the water. It wasn't the steady progression of a ship's navigation lights or the random bobbing of a small boat. This light was pulsing in a deliberate pattern. 3 long flashes, followed by 2 short ones, then a pause, then the same sequence again. The pattern was familiar. During my research on lighthouse operations, I had learned that each lighthouse had its own unique flash pattern to help ships identify their location. Beacon Point's historic pattern had been 3 long, 2 short, exactly what I was witnessing from this impossible ocean that shouldn't exist. But the lighthouse itself had been dark for over 60 years, its lens removed, its power supply long disconnected. Comment below what you think really happened next. I grabbed my camera and tried to photograph the mysterious light, but when I looked through the viewfinder, the ocean was empty. Just dark water stretching to the horizon, with no sign of any light source. Yet when I lowered the camera and looked with my naked eyes, the pulsing beacon was clearly visible, growing brighter and closer with each repetition of its pattern. The metallic stairs rang under my feet as I hurried down from the lens room, each step echoing strangely in the confined space of the lighthouse tower. But the echoes seemed wrong. Instead of fading after each footstep, they seemed to multiply and amplify, as if invisible feet were following me down the stairs. By the time I reached the bottom, the cacophony of phantom footsteps was so overwhelming that I had to stop and press my hands against my ears. When the echoes finally stopped, I found myself in complete silence. Not the normal quiet of an abandoned building, but an absolute absence of sound that felt unnatural and oppressive. No wind, no distant waves, no creaking of old timbers settling. It was as if the lighthouse existed in a bubble completely separate from the natural world. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss any supernatural content. I pushed open the door at the base of the lighthouse tower, expecting to step back into the normal September afternoon I had left behind, but instead encountered something that defied all logic. The landscape around Beacon Point had changed completely. Instead of the overgrown grounds and rutted access road I had navigated just hours earlier, I found myself looking at a meticulously maintained lighthouse station circa 1962. The keeper's house showed fresh white paint with green shutters, and warm light glowed from every window. A well-tended garden flourished beside the house, with late-season vegetables and carefully arranged flower beds. The access road was paved and lined with painted stones, leading to a small parking area where a 1950s pickup truck sat beside a Coast Guard maintenance vehicle. Even the lighthouse itself appeared newly painted, its white tower gleaming in the strange twilight. But most disturbing of all was the figure I could see moving inside the keeper's house. Through the kitchen window, silhouetted against the warm interior light, was the unmistakable shape of a man going about routine domestic activities. He moved with purpose and familiarity, as if he belonged there, as if this was his home and his responsibility. I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at Thomas Whitmore, the lighthouse keeper who had vanished in 1962. Somehow I had stepped into his world, his time, his reality. The question that terrified me was whether I could step back out. Let me know in the comments if you've experienced something similar to this time displacement. Every rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible. Hallucination brought on by stress, dehydration, maybe carbon monoxide from some unknown source in the lighthouse. But the sensory details were too vivid, too consistent for any kind of mental breakdown. I could smell the salt air mixed with wood smoke from the keeper's house chimney. I could hear the normal sounds of evening settling over a lived-in homestead, a dog barking somewhere in the distance, the gentle lowing of cattle from inland farms, even the faint sound of radio music drifting from the house. I approached the keeper's house slowly, my photographer's instincts warring with a growing sense of dread. Part of me wanted to document this impossible experience, to capture proof of what was happening. But a deeper, more primal part of me recognized that I was trespassing in a reality where I didn't belong, and that my presence here might have consequences I couldn't predict or control. The front door of the house stood open, with warm light spilling out onto the freshly painted porch. Through the doorway, I could see into the living room where a man sat in a wooden chair, his back to the door. He was wearing the dark uniform of a lighthouse keeper, and his hair was the salt and pepper gray of someone in his 50s. On the table beside him sat the same leather-bound logbook I had found and lost in the abandoned version of this house. As I watched, the man, Thomas Whitmore it had to be, picked up a fountain pen and began writing in the logbook. His movements were deliberate and careful, the actions of someone maintaining an important official record. But there was something mechanical about his posture, something that suggested he was going through motions rather than acting from conscious choice. Subscribe for more spine-chilling encounters like this one. I realized I was holding my breath and forced myself to breathe normally. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the evening air, and I was terrified that Thomas might hear me and turn around. What would happen if he saw me? What would happen if I had to look into the face of a man who had been dead for over 60 years? But Thomas continued writing, oblivious to my presence. As I watched, he completed his entry and closed the logbook. Then he stood up and walked toward the back of the house, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. A few moments later, I heard a door open and close somewhere in the rear of the building. This was my chance to see what he had written, to understand what was happening in this impossible reconstruction of 1962. I crept up the porch steps, wincing at every small creak of the wooden boards under my feet. The front door remained open, inviting but somehow ominous. I stepped across the threshold into Thomas Whitmore's world. The interior of the house was exactly as it would have been in 1962, but everything was too perfect, too precisely arranged. It was like stepping into a museum diorama rather than a lived-in home. The furniture was positioned with mathematical precision, the decorative objects placed with the kind of careful attention that suggested someone had arranged them for display rather than daily use. Even the dust motes floating in the lamplight seemed to move in patterns that were too regular, too purposeful. I approached the table where the logbook lay open and read the fresh entry Thomas had just completed. The date at the top of the page was September 15, 1962, 3 days after his final real-world entry, 3 days after Hurricane Donna had struck and Thomas Whitmore had vanished. The entry, written in his careful cursive hand, read, "The photographer has arrived, just as I knew he would. He doesn't understand yet that some places exist outside of time, outside of the normal flow of events. The lighthouse calls to those who can see beyond the ordinary world. Soon he will understand his purpose here. The light must have a keeper, always. T. Whitmore. Share this video with someone who loves horror stories." My hands were shaking as I read those words. Thomas had been expecting me. Somehow, across more than 60 years, he had known I would come to Beacon Point Lighthouse. But how was that possible? And what did he mean about the light needing a keeper? I heard footsteps approaching from the back of the house and quickly backed away from the table. Thomas appeared in the doorway that led to the kitchen, and for the first time, I saw his face clearly. It was exactly as I had imagined from the old photographs I'd seen in town, weathered by years of sea air, with kind but tired eyes, and a graying beard that spoke of long, lonely months tending the lighthouse. But there was something wrong with his expression, something that made my skin crawl with instinctive fear. His eyes, while looking directly at me, didn't seem to see me as I was. Instead, he appeared to be looking through me, as if he was seeing some other version of me, some other moment in time. When he spoke, his voice had the hollow quality of an echo, as if the words were reaching me across a great distance. "You've been walking through my memories," Thomas said, his tone neither friendly nor hostile, just matter of fact. "Moving through the moments I lived here, the experiences that tied my soul to this place. But memories are just shadows, photographer. The real work happens when the storm comes. Let me know if you want a part 2 to this story." I tried to respond, to ask him what he meant, but no sound emerged from my throat. It was as if the air itself had become too thick to carry my voice. Thomas continued speaking, seemingly unaware of my inability to reply. "Hurricane Donna took my body, but it couldn't take my duty. The light must shine. The ships must be warned. The coast must be protected. For 60 years, I've waited for someone who could understand, someone who could see beyond the ordinary world. You have that sight, photographer. That's why you were drawn here, why you could see the logbook, why you're standing in my kitchen now." He walked past me toward the front door, and I caught a whiff of something that made my stomach lurch. The smell of salt water and seaweed, the smell of someone who had drowned in the ocean. As he reached the doorway, Thomas turned back to look at me one final time. "The storm is coming again," he said. "When it arrives, you'll understand your choice. You can leave this place and return to your ordinary world, carrying the memory of what you've seen like a burden you'll never be able to share. Or you can stay and help me tend the light, help me guide the lost souls safely through the darkness. But know this, if you choose to stay, there is no going back. The lighthouse keeps its keepers forever. Hit the like button if this story is getting scary." With those words, Thomas stepped through the doorway and vanished. Not gradually, not like a normal person walking away, but instantly, as if he had never been there at all. The house around me began to change as well. the perfect 1962 interior fading and blurring like a photograph being dissolved in chemicals. The warm light grew dim, the carefully arranged furniture became covered with dust and decay, and the smell of salt water and seaweed was replaced by the musty odor of long abandonment. Within minutes, I was standing in the same ruined keeper's house I had explored earlier that day. The front door hung open on rusted hinges, the windows were boarded up, and ivy crept through cracks in the walls. But on the table in the living room, exactly where Thomas had left it, sat the leather-bound logbook. This time, when I opened it, the pages showed entries spanning from 1962 to the present day. Every few months, in the same careful cursive handwriting, Thomas Whitmore had recorded his observations, entries about ships he had guided safely to harbor, about storms he had weathered, about visitors who had come to the lighthouse over the decades. And there, on the final page, was an entry dated today, describing my arrival and my exploration of his domain. Paragraph 3, 2,000 words. Supernatural presence, confirmation and intensification. The logbook in my hands felt impossibly heavy, as if it contained far more than just paper and ink. Each page I turned revealed another impossible entry from Thomas Whitmore, documenting decades of supernatural lighthouse keeping that defied every law of physics and mortality I understood. The entries weren't just observations. They were detailed records of ships guided safely through treacherous waters by a lighthouse that had been officially dark for over 60 years. One entry from 1987 described a fishing vessel caught in a sudden fog bank, guided to safety by the lighthouse beacon. Another from 1995 detailed a Coast Guard rescue operation that had been directed to the exact location of survivors by the lighthouse's beam, even though the rescuers later reported that no light had been visible from their position. Entry after entry described impossible interventions, supernatural assistance provided by a dead lighthouse keeper who refused to abandon his post. But the entries from recent years were different, more urgent, filled with a growing desperation that made my chest tight with anxiety. Thomas wrote about feeling his connection to the physical world growing weaker, about his ability to maintain the lighthouse beacon failing. He described a growing darkness on the ocean, something malevolent that was drawn to the spaces between worlds, feeding on the confusion and fear of lost souls. "The barrier grows thin," read an entry from last month. "Without a living keeper to anchor the light in the physical world, I cannot hold back what seeks to cross over. The photographer will come soon. He must choose quickly, or all will be lost to the dark waters. Comment below what you think was really happening here." I slammed the logbook shut, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The implications of what I was reading were staggering and terrifying. Thomas Whitmore believed that I had been specifically called to Beacon Point to take over his supernatural duties as lighthouse keeper. But that was impossible. I was a photographer, not a maritime safety expert, and certainly not someone equipped to handle supernatural responsibilities. As if responding to my thoughts, the lighthouse began to change around me. The ruined keeper's house started to shift and blur, walls becoming transparent, furniture phasing in and out of existence like double-exposed photographs. Through the translucent walls, I could see multiple versions of the same rooms. The 1962 version where Thomas still lived, the abandoned version I had originally explored, and something else, something darker that made my vision swim when I tried to focus on it. The temperature in the house dropped dramatically, my breath forming visible clouds that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have. The sounds of the outside world, wind through trees, distant waves, the normal ambient noise of a coastal evening, began to fade until I was surrounded by the same oppressive silence I had experienced in the lighthouse tower. Then I heard it, the deep, resonant blast of a foghorn that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound was so loud and unexpected that I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair that was sometimes there and sometimes not. As the horn blast faded, it was replaced by something infinitely worse, the sound of voices calling out over water, the desperate cries of people lost at sea. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss any supernatural content. The voices were coming from outside, from the direction of the ocean. I stumbled through the shifting walls of the keeper's house and out onto the porch, where the world had changed once again. The calm September evening I remembered was gone, replaced by a scene from a maritime nightmare. The sky was black with storm clouds that moved in unnatural patterns, swirling and pulsing like living things. The ocean had transformed into a churning mass of dark water, punctuated by whitecaps that seemed to glow with their own sickly phosphorescence. But most terrifying of all were the lights on the water. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, scattered across the turbulent sea like fallen stars. They weren't the steady lights of modern vessels. These were the warm, flickering lights of oil lamps and kerosene lanterns, the lights of ships from an earlier era. And from each point of light came voices, calling for help, begging for guidance, crying out for someone to show them the way to safety. I realized I was witnessing the accumulated maritime disasters of centuries, all the ships that had foundered off the Maine coast, all the souls that had been lost to the dark waters. They were trapped somehow, caught between worlds, visible only when the barrier between the physical and supernatural became thin enough for them to break through. Above it all, cutting through the chaos like a sword of pure white light, was the beacon from Beacon Point Lighthouse. The tower behind me blazed with impossible brilliance, its beam sweeping across the supernatural seascape in the familiar pattern of 3 long flashes, followed by 2 short ones. But the light wasn't coming from any physical source. The lens room was still empty, the electrical system still disconnected. This was pure spiritual energy, the manifestation of Thomas Whitmore's supernatural commitment to his duty. Let me know in the comments if you've experienced something similar to this maritime phantasm. I could see Thomas himself now, not as the solid figure I had encountered in the keeper's house, but as a translucent form standing in the lens room of the lighthouse. He moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting controls that weren't there, maintaining equipment that existed only in the supernatural realm. His lighthouse keeper's uniform appeared to be soaked with seawater, and his hair and beard moved as if he was standing underwater. As I watched, the supernatural lighthouse beam guided one of the phantom vessels safely away from the rocky shore. The light on that ship grew steady and warm as it moved toward what I hoped was some kind of spiritual harbor, some place where lost souls could finally find peace. But for every ship that was guided to safety, 2 more appeared on the horizon, and Thomas was beginning to show signs of exhaustion that frightened me. The spectral lighthouse keeper flickered like a failing bulb, his form becoming less substantial with each sweep of the beacon. I could see the incredible effort it was taking for him to maintain the supernatural lighthouse, to provide guidance for the lost souls that appeared whenever the barrier between worlds grew thin. He was literally burning himself out, using his spiritual essence as fuel for the beacon that kept maritime disasters from becoming eternal tragedies. That's when I understood what he had meant about needing a living keeper. The supernatural lighthouse required an anchor in the physical world, someone with a living body and vital energy who could help maintain the beacon without being consumed by it. Thomas had been doing this work alone for over 60 years, but his connection to the physical world was finally breaking down. Soon, he would fade away entirely, and the dark waters would claim all the lost souls he had been protecting. Subscribe for more terrifying true stories like this one. But understanding the situation and knowing how to help were 2 entirely different things. I had no training in lighthouse operations, supernatural or otherwise. I didn't understand how the spirit beacon worked, how to guide phantom ships to safety, or how to maintain the barrier between worlds. All I had was a camera and a growing certainty that I was witnessing something far beyond my ability to handle. As if sensing my thoughts, Thomas turned from his work in the lens room and looked directly at me. Even at this distance, even through the supernatural storm that raged around Beacon Point, I could see his eyes clearly. They held a mixture of hope and desperation that made my chest ache with sympathetic pain. The choice must be made now. His voice carried impossibly over the wind and waves, reaching me with perfect clarity. The storm grows stronger, and I cannot hold it much longer. Join me, and together we can keep the light burning for another generation. Refuse, and all these souls will be lost to the dark waters forever. To demonstrate his point, Thomas allowed the beacon to flicker and dim for just a moment. Immediately, the phantom ships on the water began to drift toward the rocky shore, their occupants' cries of distress growing more desperate and terrified. I watched in horror as one vessel, a sailing ship that looked like it was from the early 1800s, began to break apart on the jagged rocks below. The phantom crew's screams cut through the supernatural storm like knives, and I watched helplessly as their souls scattered into the dark water like dying embers. Thomas immediately strengthened the beacon again, but the effort caused him to flicker more violently. I could see that each use of the supernatural light was draining him further, bringing him closer to complete dissolution. How many more ships could he save before he faded away entirely? Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. The weight of the decision pressed down on me like a physical force. Stay and help Thomas maintain the supernatural lighthouse, knowing that I would likely never return to my normal life. never see my family and friends again, never pursue my photography career, or leave, knowing that my refusal would condemn countless souls to an eternity lost in the dark waters between worlds. But as I stood there paralyzed by the magnitude of the choice, something else began to emerge from the supernatural storm. At the far edge of my vision, where the phantom ships appeared on the horizon, I could see something that wasn't a vessel in distress. It was larger, darker, moving with purposeful intent rather than the helpless drifting of the lost souls, and it was heading directly for Beacon Point. "The Devourer comes," Thomas's voice reached me again, now tinged with genuine fear. "It feeds on lost souls, on the spaces between worlds. For 60 years, the lighthouse has kept it at bay, but now..." His voice trailed off as his form flickered again, more violently than before. The dark shape on the water was getting closer, and as it approached, the phantom ships began to change. Instead of drifting helplessly toward the rocks, they started moving toward the approaching darkness with unnatural speed. The desperate cries of their crews changed from calls for help to screams of absolute terror as they realized they were being pulled toward something far worse than shipwreck. Let me know in the comments what you think I should have done. I watched in horror as the first phantom vessel was engulfed by the dark presence. The ship's lights went out instantly, and the screams of its crew were cut off mid-cry. The darkness seemed to grow larger and more substantial as it consumed the lost souls, feeding on their spiritual energy. And there were dozens more phantom ships scattered across the supernatural seascape, all of them now being drawn inexorably toward the Devourer. That's when I understood the true stakes of Thomas's request. This wasn't just about maintaining a supernatural lighthouse or helping lost souls find peace. This was about preventing something ancient and malevolent from breaking through into our world, something that would use the accumulated spiritual energy of centuries of maritime disasters to anchor itself in physical reality. Without conscious thought, I found myself running toward the lighthouse tower. The door at the base stood open, revealing the spiral staircase that led up to the lens room where Thomas fought his desperate battle against the encroaching darkness. Each step I took felt like a commitment, a step away from my ordinary life and towards something I didn't fully understand, but knew was necessary. Hit the like button if you're on the edge of your seat. The climb seemed to take forever, each metal step ringing with supernatural resonance that seemed to echo through dimensions. Halfway up, I could feel the presence of the Devourer like a weight pressing against my mind, trying to fill my thoughts with despair and hopelessness. The temperature dropped so low that ice began forming on the stair railings, and my breath came in sharp puffs that crystallized instantly in the air. When I finally reached the lens room, I found Thomas in a state of near collapse. His ghostly form was barely visible, flickering like a candle flame in a strong wind. The supernatural beacon continued to operate, but its light was growing weaker with each rotation. Through the windows, I could see that several more phantom ships had been consumed by the darkness, which was now less than a mile from shore. "You came," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible above the supernatural storm. "I wasn't sure. After 60 years of isolation, I wasn't sure anyone would choose this burden willingly." "I don't understand what I'm supposed to do," I admitted, my voice shaking with fear and adrenaline. "I'm not a lighthouse keeper. I don't know how any of this works." Thomas managed a weak smile. "The lighthouse doesn't need technical knowledge," he explained. "It needs will, determination, and a living soul to anchor it in the physical world. Your life force, combined with my knowledge and experience, can maintain the beacon indefinitely. But the choice to stay must be yours alone. I cannot and will not force this upon you. Subscribe if you want to know how this terrifying encounter ends." Outside, the Devourer had consumed half the Phantom fleet, and was now close enough that I could make out its true nature. It wasn't a ship or sea creature, but rather a massive void in reality itself, a hungry emptiness that consumed light, sound, and spiritual energy. Looking at it directly made my vision blur and my mind reel with vertigo, as if I was staring into an infinite abyss. "How do I help?" I asked, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. Thomas pointed to the center of the lens room, where the mounting hardware for the original Fresnel lens still remained. "Place your hands on the focal point," he instructed. "Open your mind to the spiritual realm, and let your life force flow into the beacon. I'll guide the light, but you'll provide the power to maintain it." I approached the mounting hardware with trembling steps. The metal was ice cold to the touch, but as soon as my palms made contact with the focal point, I felt a surge of energy that was both terrifying and exhilarating. It was like touching a live electrical wire, but instead of pain, I felt a connection to something vast and ancient and infinitely important. The lighthouse beacon blazed with renewed strength, its light cutting through the supernatural storm with laser-like intensity. I could feel the power flowing through me, drawing on my life force but also amplifying it, as if the lighthouse itself was designed to enhance and focus human spiritual energy. Thomas's ghostly form became more solid and defined as the beacon strengthened, his 60 years of accumulated knowledge and experience merging with my living vitality. Comment below what you think happened to the Devourer. Together, we turned the full power of the supernatural lighthouse against the approaching darkness. The beacon's light struck the Devourer like a physical blow, causing it to recoil and emit a sound that was felt rather than heard, a vibration that seemed to shake the foundations of reality itself. The consumed phantom ships began to break free from its influence, their lights flickering back to life as they escaped the void's gravitational pull. But the battle was far from over. The Devourer began to change tactics, no longer approaching directly, but instead circling Beacon Point like a predator stalking its prey. It sent tendrils of darkness probing toward the lighthouse, testing our defenses, looking for weaknesses in the barrier we maintained. "It's learning," Thomas warned, his voice now clear and strong thanks to the renewed beacon. "The Devourer has encountered lighthouse defenses before, in other places, other times. It knows how to adapt." As if to prove his point, the darkness began to attack from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing us to split the beacon's focus. I felt the strain immediately. Maintaining the lighthouse's power while dividing its attention was like trying to hold multiple conversations while running a marathon. My life force was being drawn upon faster than I could replenish it, and I could feel myself beginning to weaken. That's when I understood the true nature of the sacrifice Thomas had been asking me to make. This wasn't a temporary commitment or a brief supernatural adventure. This was a permanent transformation, a fundamental change in the nature of my existence. To truly help maintain the lighthouse, I would need to bind my soul to this place just as Thomas had done 60 years ago. Let me know if you want me to continue with part 4 of this incredible story. The realization should have terrified me, should have sent me running back down those spiral stairs and out of Beacon Point forever. Instead, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me, looking out at the phantom ships we were protecting, at the lost souls who depended on our light for guidance and salvation. I understood that some responsibilities transcended individual desires or fears. "I understand now," I told Thomas, my hand still firmly planted on the lighthouse's focal point. "This is bigger than just me, bigger than my normal life. These souls need protection, and this darkness needs to be contained. I choose to stay." Thomas looked at me with something approaching relief mixed with profound sadness. "Once the binding is complete," he warned, "there is truly no going back. You will become part of Beacon Point, just as I have been for 60 years. Your physical body will remain, but your soul will be tied to this lighthouse forever." "I understand," I repeated, and meant it completely. The binding ritual was unlike anything I could have imagined. Thomas began to recite words in a language that sounded like a mixture of Gaelic and something far older, something that predated human speech. As he spoke, the lighthouse beacon began to pulse in rhythm with the incantation, and I felt my consciousness expanding beyond the confines of my physical body. Suddenly, I could sense every phantom ship on the supernatural sea, could feel the fear and confusion of their ghostly crews, could perceive the malevolent hunger of the Devourer as it continued to circle our defenses. But more than that, I could sense the lighthouse itself as a living entity, an ancient guardian that had been protecting this stretch of coast since long before the first stone of its tower had been laid. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss any supernatural content. The binding reached its crescendo as my life force merged completely with the lighthouse's spiritual matrix. I felt my mortal concerns and earthly attachments falling away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of purpose and duty that transcended individual existence. I was no longer just a photographer who had stumbled into a supernatural encounter. I was a guardian, a keeper of the light, a protector of lost souls. With our combined power, Thomas and I launched a coordinated assault against the Devourer. The lighthouse beacon split into multiple focused beams, each one targeting a different tendril of darkness. The void creature writhed and contracted under our attack, its hungry emptiness unable to withstand the pure spiritual energy we directed against it. For a moment, it seemed as though we might actually destroy the ancient evil entirely, but the Devourer had survived for millennia by knowing when to retreat and regroup. With a sound like reality tearing, it began to withdraw from the physical realm, pulling back into whatever dimensional space it normally inhabited. "It's not defeated," Thomas warned as the darkness faded from view, "merely driven back. It will return when it senses weakness, when it thinks our guard is down. This is not a battle that can be won permanently, only fought continuously." As the supernatural storm began to subside, and the phantom ships found safe passage to whatever spiritual harbor awaited them, I felt the full weight of my new existence settling upon me. I was no longer entirely human, no longer entirely alive in the conventional sense. I had become something between mortality and eternity, bound to Beacon Point Lighthouse by duty, purpose, and an unbreakable spiritual commitment. Share your own paranormal experiences in the comments section. The transformation was complete, but understanding my new existence would take time. As the supernatural storm faded and the phantom ships disappeared into whatever realm awaits lost souls who find guidance, I found myself still standing in the lens room of Beacon Point Lighthouse. But everything had changed. My perception, my purpose, my very nature as a conscious being. Thomas was more solid now, no longer the flickering, ghostly figure I had first encountered. The merging of our spiritual energies had strengthened both of us, creating a partnership that could maintain the lighthouse's supernatural defenses indefinitely. But I was beginning to understand the true cost of this arrangement. My physical body remained, but it was no longer entirely my own. I could feel the lighthouse's ancient consciousness merged with my human awareness, its centuries of accumulated purpose flowing through my thoughts like a second stream of consciousness. I was still myself. My memories, personality, and individual perspective remained intact, but I was also something more, something that transcended normal human existence. "The hardest part," Thomas explained as we watched the last of the phantom lights disappear into the distance, "is letting go of the person you used to be. Not losing yourself, but accepting that you can never go back to the limitations of purely mortal existence." I understood what he meant. Looking down from the lens room, I could see my Jeep parked where I had left it that afternoon, but it seemed like a relic from someone else's life. The concerns that had driven me to Beacon Point, my photography career, my planned exhibition, my ordinary human ambitions, felt distant and unimportant compared to the cosmic responsibility I had accepted. Yet there was something profoundly satisfying about this new existence. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The lighthouse's purpose resonated with something deep in my soul, as if I had been unconsciously searching for this kind of meaningful work my entire life. Let me know in the comments if you think I made the right choice. Over the following hours, or was it days, time seemed to flow differently within the lighthouse's influence. Thomas taught me the intricacies of supernatural lighthouse keeping. It wasn't just about maintaining the beacon, though that was certainly important. The lighthouse served as a multidimensional guardian, protecting not just the physical coastline, but the barrier between worlds. I learned to sense disturbances in the spiritual realm, to recognize the signs that indicated when lost souls were approaching our reality. Some were maritime disasters from centuries past, phantom ships carrying crews who didn't realize they had died. Others were more recent losses, modern vessels that had foundered in storms or fog, their occupants still clinging to life through sheer force of will and desperation. But most challenging were the entities like the Devourer, ancient predators that fed on spiritual energy and sought to break through into our reality. The lighthouse's beam wasn't just a navigation aid. It was a weapon specifically designed to combat such creatures, powered by the life force and determination of its keepers. Every lighthouse has its own personality, Thomas explained during one of our rest periods. Beacon Point has always been a warrior, a fighter. That's why it chose keepers with the strength and will to battle the darkness. Other lighthouses serve different purposes. Some are healers, some are guides for peaceful transitions between life and death. But this one was built to fight. I could feel the truth of his words in the lighthouse's spiritual matrix. Beacon Point had been constructed on a site where the barrier between worlds was naturally thin, specifically to serve as a guardian against supernatural incursions. The human keepers were just the most recent addition to a defense system that had been operating in various forms for thousands of years. Subscribe for more spine-chilling true stories like this one. But the lighthouse wasn't just about cosmic battles against ancient evils. Much of our work involved gentler guidance, helping recently deceased souls understand their situation and find their way to whatever comes next. These encounters were often heartbreaking but ultimately beautiful, as confused spirits found peace through our intervention. I remember one particularly poignant case from my early weeks as keeper. A young fisherman who had been lost in a storm off the coast appeared as a phantom light on our supernatural radar. He was caught in a loop, repeatedly trying to return to his home port, unable to understand why he couldn't make contact with his family. Thomas and I guided him to shore using the lighthouse beacon, then helped him understand what had happened. The moment of realization, when he finally accepted that he had died in the storm, was devastating to witness. But it was followed immediately by a transformation as he let go of his earthly attachments and moved toward whatever realm awaits souls who die at sea. "Thank you," he whispered as he faded from our perception, his voice carrying the peace of someone who had found resolution. "Tell my family I'm safe now." These interactions reminded me that our work wasn't just about fighting cosmic horrors or maintaining mystical barriers. At its core, lighthouse keeping was about service, helping lost souls find their way home, whether that home was in this world or the next. Comment below what you think about this supernatural calling. As weeks turned to months, I began to understand the full scope of what Thomas had been doing alone for 60 years. The supernatural threats were constant but varied. Sometimes ancient evils like the Devourer, sometimes newer entities born from modern anxieties and fears, sometimes simply the accumulated spiritual weight of centuries of maritime tragedy. But beyond the dramatic battles were countless smaller interventions, ships guided away from dangerous reefs by phantom lighthouse beams that appeared only when needed, search and rescue operations mysteriously directed to the exact location of survivors, weather patterns subtly influenced to prevent devastating storms from reaching populated coastal areas. We were invisible guardians, protecting thousands of people who would never know they had been in danger. It was thankless work in the most literal sense. No one could thank us for disasters that had been prevented, lives that had been saved through supernatural intervention. Yet I found this anonymity deeply satisfying. There was something pure about working without recognition or reward, motivated solely by the knowledge that our efforts prevented suffering and tragedy. It felt like the most honest form of service possible. Thomas gradually began to fade as his spiritual energy merged more completely with the lighthouse itself. This wasn't death. He had been dead for over 60 years, but rather a transformation into something more elemental and eternal. His knowledge and experience became part of the lighthouse's permanent matrix, while his individual consciousness found the peace that had eluded him during his decades of solitary guardian duty. "You'll do well," he told me during one of our final conversations as separate entities. "The lighthouse chose correctly when it called you here, and someday, when your time comes, you'll help guide the next keeper just as I've guided you." Share this video with someone who loves paranormal content. The day Thomas finally completed his transformation was both sad and beautiful. His ghostly form dissolved into points of light that merged with the lighthouse beacon, and suddenly I could feel his presence throughout the entire structure. He had become part of Beacon Point's spiritual infrastructure, his dedication and knowledge now permanently woven into the lighthouse's defenses. I was alone now in a way I had never experienced before, the sole human consciousness in a realm that existed between worlds, but I wasn't lonely. The lighthouse itself was alive with accumulated purpose and memory, and I could sense Thomas's continued presence even though he no longer appeared as a separate entity. My old life felt like a half-remembered dream. Occasionally, I would think about the photography exhibition I had been planning, the friends who must be wondering about my disappearance, the family members who would never understand what had happened to me. But these concerns felt abstract, like worries from someone else's existence. The truth was that I had found my calling in the most literal sense possible. Every day brought new challenges, new souls to guide, new threats to combat. The work was demanding and often dangerous, but it was also deeply meaningful in a way that my previous life had never been. As I write this, using the same logbook that Thomas had maintained for over 60 years, I realize that I'm documenting my experiences for the same reason he did. Someday, another keeper will be called to Beacon Point. Someone will need to understand what this work entails, what sacrifices it requires, and what rewards it offers. Let me know in the comments if you believe this story is real. To that future keeper, whoever you may be, I want you to know that this choice will change everything about your existence. You will lose your normal human life, your ordinary concerns, your connection to the everyday world. But in exchange, you will gain something far more valuable: the knowledge that your existence has cosmic significance, that your daily work prevents suffering on a scale most people can't imagine. The lighthouse calls only those who are ready for this transformation, who possess the strength and dedication necessary for eternal guardian duty. If you're reading this, If you found your way to Beacon Point and discovered this logbook, then you're probably already feeling the pull of this ancient purpose. The choice is yours to make, just as it was mine. But know that whatever you decide, you won't be making it alone. The lighthouse has been waiting for you, just as it waited for me, just as it waited for Thomas Whitmore all those years ago. The beacon shines eternal, and the vigil continues. If this supernatural lighthouse encounter gave you chills, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more true paranormal stories, and hit that notification bell. Share your own unexplained experiences in the comments below. I read every single one and feature the best stories in future videos. What would you have done if you encountered Thomas Whitmore and faced the choice between returning to ordinary life or becoming an eternal lighthouse keeper? Let me know your thoughts, and don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves real ghost stories and supernatural mysteries.